bowling ball going back and forth in a line from you to me.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Smoking Gun series. In this particular video, I would actually like to focus more on Raza's background because I think it puts this into better context for those that are watching this. So I'm going to ask Raza to explain a little bit more and get into some details about his background and what led him to where he is now, in other words, his journey. And I'd actually like to start, Raza, welcome back. I'd like to ask you, you had an actually very interesting start and very positive influence in your life in terms of your parents. I kind of like you to start there because not all of us have had that positive influence. Talk about putting somebody on the right track, if you could start there.
Yes, I was very fortunate that my mother raised me up to be skeptical of the government. So before I tell my story, I would like to say that, first of all, this is not a popularity contest for me. Most people, when they hear my story, really hate me. Half the people are going to hate me, half the other people are going to think I'm making this up. And that's understandable because my story is quite hard to believe. But, you know, all I can tell you is just try to research the things I'm about to say, you know, and then you'll come to the same conclusions I have. So I think the best way to do this, in my opinion, is first tell what it is that I have insider information about. And then the second thing is, how did I come to know that? So as I mentioned before, I am an insider, I am a whistleblower, I am revealing some inside information here. So the main things I'm telling you is that, first of all, China knows the moon landings were a hoax. And the second thing is, they have evidence that it was a hoax. They have photographs of the Apollo landing sites. And the third thing is they actually have a deal with NASA. The deal is, if you guys don't blow the whistle on us, we will continue sharing technology with you. And that has been the deal ever since 1984. So it's difficult for many people to understand. A lot of people ask me, why isn't China blowing the whistle? And China's trying to maintain friendship. So this is the Chinese mentality. There's a saying in ancient Chinese philosophy. It says, keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer. So we're not trying to make enemies here with America. You know, we're trying to keep friendship. The Chinese government agreed not to blow the whistle on the Apollo missions. Now, the second thing is, how did I come to know this information? So I was a university student in America. In 1999, I graduated from Portland State University, and I was majoring in astrophysics and quantum mechanics. And during that time, I was approached by several scouts. You know, different universities send scouts into my university. And many of these scouts were trying to recruit me to other universities. And one of them actually offered me a job at NASA. But I turned them down, you know, because I said, no, I'm not interested. I'm leaving the country. And I went, after that, in 1999, I moved to India and I started studying medicine in India. So many people ask me, why do you have an Indian sounding name? It's because I'm actually a medical doctor who studied in India. But the interesting thing is, I was taking a trip to America in 2001, and I happened to be in New York City when 9/11 happened. And I started doing a lot of research at that time. Now, I want to mention the name of one person, which I think most everybody should try to find. His name is Mike Ruppert. He did a series of lectures in 2001. This was just after 9/11. He's dead now, and I'm pretty sure they killed him. You know, the official story is that he did suicide. But no, that's not. Anyway, why? So because of these lectures he gave about 9/11, many people haven't heard his name. In fact, it's quite shadow banned. You know, it's hard to find any of his videos now. But if you search hard enough, you can find it. But most importantly is in 2001, he gave a lecture about the insider trading just before 9/11. They were selling stocks in the airlines because they knew those were the airlines that were going to crash. So Mike Rupert is the famous guy who exposed these things. Now, Mike Rupert is an ex-LA police officer. He was in the narcotics division, and he quit the LA police because the CIA was trying to get him involved in the illegal drug trafficking. So he quit the LA, and he gave this series of lectures in 2001, just after 9/11. Here's the thing which I learned was that in 2001, as we all know, just the day after 9/11, the US troops invaded Afghanistan. Most people are aware of that. Just the very next day, the US troops invaded. They were already there waging it, but they invaded Afghanistan. Now the question is why? Why did just the day after 9/11, the US troops invade Afghanistan? Is because they were trying to cut off the Chinese oil pipeline. This is what I learned from Mike Rupert, and I was shocked to learn these things. So then I started doing more of my own research, and I found out that China does not have a private central bank. Since 1949, Chairman Mao kicked out the Rothschilds and all the Freemasons and all these things. If you look at it in the bigger picture, 9/11 was actually an attack on China because it was 6 days after 9/11, September 17, China joined the World Trade Organization. They had no choice because the US troops had cut off the pipeline, the oil pipeline they were trying to build in Afghanistan. Okay, so I learned about these things. Wow, China doesn't have a private central bank, and this 9/11 was actually trying to bring China back into the central banking cartel. So I moved to China in 2008. Many people ask me, are you a communist? They always call me these names like that. No, I'm not a communist. I'm not a member of the Chinese Communist Party or anything like that. I agree with them on many issues and disagree with them on some issues, but I'm not a Chinese nationalist or anything like that. But I do work with the government, okay? I don't work for the government because I'm not a member of the Communist Party, but I work with the government on a lot of different projects because of my background in quantum mechanics. I first learned about the NASA agreement in 2016. I was offered a job with the Chinese Space Agency in 2016. And when I went there, I asked them, I said, obviously you guys know that no human being has ever stepped foot on the moon. And
Right.
They said, of course we know that. And they said, we have an agreement with NASA not to blow the whistle. So the agreement goes like this: if you guys don't blow the whistle, we will continue sharing technology with you. And if you just wait for it, we will blow the whistle on ourselves. Okay? So this agreement was made in 1984. Okay, this was when China was admitted to the Outer Space Treaty of the UN. Okay, in 1984. If you just go to the Outer Space Treaty, you can see China was let in 1984, and this is where they made the agreement. From that time, the EU and the NASA were helping the Chinese space program from 1984. And they just said, look, we will continue supplying technology with you, just don't blow the whistle on the moon landings. NASA also said, we are going to admit it was a hoax just after Artemis 3. Okay, as soon as we can land a man on the moon for real, then we're going to admit that that was the first man. So China, taking their word for it, they agreed to do that. Myself personally, I never agreed to not blow the whistle. You could say that here in China, it wouldn't be gentlemanly of me to be doing what I'm doing, because there's an unwritten agreement among all Chinese space agency employees is that we just don't talk about these things. In the schools here in China, they do not teach that the moon landings were real, okay? It's not taught to children in schools here that human beings have stepped foot on the moon. So we just kind of avoid the subject. We don't say whether it's real or we don't say whether it's fake. There are many Chinese web pages which talk about it being fake, and there's even mainstream Chinese documentaries about it being fake, but they don't publish that in English, Anyhow, the point is, I only come onto YouTube and Facebook because these sites are actually banned by China, right? So I'm pretty much free to say whatever I want there because they're not monitoring this anyway. If I were to make my own Chinese webpage, right, then they would monitor that. And that would be ungentlemanly of me to do that in China, in Chinese. Us, the people who work for the Chinese Space Agency, we don't publicly expose it as a hoax.
Yeah. I have a question for you, Raza, if you don't mind. So basically what you're saying is that you're not speaking for China nor the space agency, you're speaking for yourself. And that gives you some cover here, right?
Right. I could lose my job if they found out I was doing this,
Okay.
Definitely. It's ungentlemanly of me because it's kind of an unwritten thing. We don't talk about it, the hoax, publicly in China anyway.
Okay. The other thing that I just want you to elaborate slightly on, we get back to the topic at hand here, and you mentioned the private central bank. There's probably some viewers out there, a lot of the viewers are really in tune with what you're talking about. For those that are not really understanding the importance of having a private central bank, pro or con, maybe you can just give a little bit of background on that.
Yes. As I mentioned, I'm quite a historian. My first book is about to be published about the history of the private central banks. And this is the most important thing because once a country has a private central bank, then all of the politicians are going to be puppets of that private central bank. The most important thing you could ever study is the history of the creation of the private central banks. It all began in 1609 with the creation of the Dutch Republic, which was the first private central bank. And then the Dutch took over England in 1694. They created the first private central bank of England. And then in 1800 was the first private central bank of France. And then in 1893 was the first private central bank of Italy. And then they came to America. In 1913, as we all know, was the creation of the private central bank of America. And then they went to, of course, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was created, the private central bank, in 1917. And then Germany in 1918 was the creation of the Weimar Republic. And finally, in 1939 was the creation of the private central bank of Spain. So pretty much by that time, they had control over the whole world. Every country had a private central bank at that time by 1939. So I made a documentary about this. It's a really nice documentary in case you haven't watched it. But I didn't tell the full story there because I didn't talk about China, okay? China had a private central bank from 1912. The last emperor was kicked out of China, and then they created the private central bank of China in 1912, and that lasted until 1949. So you can say what Chairman Mao did was he did an Andrew Jackson on us. You know how Andrew Jackson ended the bank in America? That's where Chairman Mao figured out where all the problems were coming from. They were coming from the private central bank. Once the private central bank had destroyed the Chinese yen, the currency was devaluated, and like $100 couldn't buy you a loaf of bread. And Chairman Mao figured out it's all because of this private central bank. So in 1949, he ended the bank. That's why I came to China in 2008 just for that reason. It's because I don't want to live in a country where it's run by a private central bank. I don't want to pay taxes to them. I don't want to support them in any way. It's the same reason why I turned down the job for NASA, because I don't want to work for any government agency in a country run by a private central bank.
And that too, I understand now, and I'm actually researching this myself. There's a connection between the JFK assassination and the Federal Reserve Bank.
Of course, he issued the silver certificates of the Kennedy dollars. And this was a direct attempt to end the Fed. It's the same thing that Lincoln tried to do when Lincoln issued the greenbacks. At the time of Lincoln, there was no private central bank, but he knew that they were trying to weasel their way back in. So when he issued the greenbacks, he was trying to end the coming back in of the private central bank. And of course, they shot him for that. And of course, Kennedy as well. He tried to issue those silver dollars. That was a big no-no. You know, you don't try to end the private central bank.
No. And I believe, too, that Kennedy issued a formal bill through Congress on this very matter, in essence, was taking on the Federal Reserve. And I believe it was about 5 or so months before he was assassinated. So for people who are wondering at what point did they decide he had to go, that would be a pretty good reference point, correct?
Yes. There's also another key thing, was that he sent some weapons inspectors to Israel. They were searching whether Israel was only doing nuclear energy or whether they were also secretly doing nuclear weapons. And so Kennedy sent some weapons inspectors to Israel just a few months before he died. That was also a big no-no. Kennedy was concerned that Israel was not only building nuclear energy, but they were also secretly building nuclear weapons. So Kennedy sent in some weapons inspectors to Israel, and Israel was hiding all of their nuclear weapons manufacturing from those inspectors. Kennedy was in support of Israel, but he was not in support of them getting nuclear weapons. That was a big no-no. They wanted to have it, and they still have it today. This is the one thing that I agree with China on, is because China considers Israel a terrorist state. China has been supporting Palestine ever since Israel was created, and Palestine has been attacked ever since 1948. China has been like, wait a minute, who gives Israel the right to do this? Of course, as you know, China is a member of the UN. Let me just mention a couple things. In 1975, it was called the UN Resolution 3379, which declared Israel an apartheid state, basically. It's terrorism, what they're doing. So this was a UN resolution in 1975, and China was the main supporter of this. Let's be real here. What they're doing is apartheid. And then, of course, what happened in 1991, the UN passed a new resolution, the UN Resolution 4686. And that resolution said Israel is no more an apartheid state. And what they did was they made sure China was not there when they passed this resolution. Like I said, you know, there's certain things I agree with China on and certain things I disagree with them on. And I could even get in trouble. I've mentioned that in certain interviews that, you know, personally, I don't think that Tibet should belong to China. And I could actually get in trouble for saying that. That's a big no-no here in China. I mean, of course, I'm allowed to say that, but somebody who's working along with the government on certain projects, that would be ungentlemanly of me to say these things. So anyway, there's certain things I disagree on, like that. But there's other things I agree on. For example, I agree to ban pornography and many other things, you know, like they don't allow gay marriage, and there's many issues I agree with them upon.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah. I just wanted to fall back on something here, and it's about Israel. And it always struck me as a little odd that the United Nations, and there was a lot more behind the scenes goings on at the time, and I'm just giving a bare outline here. I always thought it was strange that they would set up not only a country for the Jewish people, but then put that country right in the heart of its enemies. That always struck me as being a little bit strange. And of course, common sense tells me that was done on purpose to destabilize the region.
Well, it's much more than that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
As you know, I just mentioned the history of the private central banks. One of the things these private central banks like to do is to fund both sides of a war. I mean, that's been going on ever since the Anglo-Dutch Wars. The Anglo-Dutch Wars was a series of wars fought between the Netherlands and England. It was the same bankers controlling both sides. That's going back until the 1600s, you know?
Yeah.
So there's 400 years of the same bankers controlling both sides of every war. Now, why do they do that? It's not just for financial gains. No, it's much worse than that. The reason why they do that is because in their eyes, this is helping to fulfill messianic prophecy. The reason why these guys do that is because they believe in their hearts that war and bloodshed will help to usher in the return of the Messiah. This is all written in the book of Ezekiel. They're just following it, that book, play by play, okay? The book of Ezekiel is talking about the return of the Messiah, and the Messiah is going to return when the world is full of bloodshed and hatred and war and sexual degradation. You know, they love these things. So that's why, you know, when it comes to Palestine, they could have easily wiped Palestine off the map in 1948, but they didn't want that. They want to perpetuate the torture, the terror, the bloodshed, because in their eyes, that's going to help usher in the return of the Messiah.
Exactly. And that kind of also, we're getting into another area here, and I'm going to ask you, choose your words carefully just for the censors. Number one, Kennedy himself was warning of, and I think he warned people of this 10 days before he was assassinated, and that was secret societies. Because this is a big issue for me, and I think it is for you too, Raza, and given your perspective where you are right now in China, and given your background and your perspective on, you know, the politics of it all, the last 3 years, I kind of put that into the context of it came out in the open, if I could put it that way. So you got these Freemasonic societies, you got the Illuminati, you've got a lot of these that people scoff at, but are very, very real. And as you just said, they love numbers and rituals. It's very important to them. Specific dates, very important to them. That's why, because you see all these overtones and overlaying of Illuminati symbols within, let's say, the JFK assassination, because it's them signing their work. And they have to adhere by a certain tradition, whatever way you want to put it. They have certain rules that they have to go by themselves. For example, predictive programming, which we see in Hollywood. So if you could just maybe talk about that a little bit, the secret societies and how this all culminated in the last 3 years.
First of all, let me mention this. There is a book here in China. I don't know if you can see the English is here. It's called Currency Wars. If you go to Wikipedia, okay, and you just type in Currency Wars, and it's telling you about this Chinese book. Now, this Chinese book, it talks about the fact that the Federal Reserve Bank was illegally created in 1913, and these same bankers assassinated Kennedy. Okay? And so here in China, this is not considered conspiracy theory. This is considered conspiracy fact. And this book has been read by every member of the Chinese government. You can't get into the Chinese government until you've read this book. I mean, and this book is saying the Rothschilds created the private central bank of America. They killed Kennedy. And it also mentions 9/11. And they mention the Freemasons. There's an interesting thing. The date, 9/11, September 11th, okay? That date is a Freemasonic holiday. So September 11th was an event that happened called the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, where a Scottish knight by the name of William Wallace defeated the British And this enabled the Freemasons of Scotland to survive. So they consider September the 11th like their birth date. With the attacks of 9/11, it was no coincidence that they chose this date to be the establishment of the New World Order. And also, the name of the two pillars of the Twin Towers was Boaz and Joachim. This is Freemasonic. There's two towers in every Freemasonic temple. So these two towers, they represent chaos and order. So these are the two pillars which holds up the heavens, Boaz and Joachim. These are the name of the two pillars in every Freemasonic temple. And the coming down of the pillars, the coming down of the Twin Towers, there's a Freemasonic symbolism here. It means that the old order of establishing heaven is no longer needed because the new world order has already been established. Okay? The two towers held up the heavens, but once the two towers come down, that old system of order isn't needed anymore because the new world order has already been established. So these are fully Freemasonic symbolisms. The creation of the Twin Towers, the coming down of the towers, and you can see, like a Disney and all these others were showing the symbolism of the towers coming down, and even Hitler, he went to
Vimy Ridge
to visit the Twin Tower temple there in
France.
I don't know if you're familiar with that one.
Well, I haven't seen it, no, but that's interesting.
Yeah, there's a Twin Tower. I think it's a World War I museum.
That is fascinating.
So coming back to my point, in China, this is not considered conspiracy theory. This is considered conspiracy fact. All this stuff, how the Rothschilds illegally created the Fed, this is what China is trying to prevent. We're trying to fight for our freedom here. We don't want to have a private central bank. I mean, this was what the Korean War was about. China was trying to help North Korea free themselves from the private central bank of South Korea. And this is also what the Vietnam War was about. China was also trying to help Vietnam escape from their private central bank, but it didn't work.
Some people are going to label you, and I want to clarify this, some people are going to label you a communist for saying that. So, be prepared for that. And I thought I would just bring that up because you have a counter argument to that accusation. And I'd just like you to give that counter argument.
Well, first of all, many people don't know that Karl Marx was expelled from Germany. He had to go live in England, where he had to live the rest of his life out, basically in hiding. He couldn't even speak English, and he wasn't allowed to publish any more books. So he was banned from Germany. And the reason he was banned from Germany was because he did not agree with the communists who were planning on launching the Bolshevik Revolution. So when you say the word communism, we're talking about Bolshevik communism. Bolshevik communism was created by the same bankers who created the Private Central Bank of America. The Bolsheviks, Trotsky, and they were all puppets. They were put in place, given money by the bankers in America to launch the Bolshevik Revolution. And the first thing they did was they created the Private Central Bank of the Soviet Union in 1917. So this is why Marx was actually against communism. That's why he was expelled from Germany, because he knew that they were planning on doing this. And he said, this is not the communism I want to create. So my definition of communism is Bolshevik communism, which is just a puppet show. America versus the Soviet Union. This was just a puppet show. It's the same bankers controlling both sides. Like I said, I'm not a communist. I'm not a Marxist. I'm just a person who studies history, and I'm a person who wants to live in a country which doesn't have a private central bank, and I hope that more and more countries will free themselves from the clutches of this. There's a hand-in-hand thing here with countries who are against Israel. What other country was critical of Israel? There's only been a few. Number one is China. Number two is North Korea. Another person who did criticize Israel was Chavez in Venezuela. And he also tried to end the private central bank. And he did. But he did it in a different way. Instead of just ending the bank. What he did was he issued a new currency. So there's two sets of currency in Venezuela. One is controlled by the private central bank, and one is a national currency created by Chavez. So he didn't kick out the bankers. He just provided an alternative for the citizens. Mm-hmm. And of course, the people are going to go to that. If he would have just gone ahead and kicked them out, then he might still be alive today.
Yeah, I was going to say I have a lot of suspicions about what really killed Chavez. No doubt he was obviously poisoned. Look, there's one point I want to bring up before we move on here, just to connect the dots here. And you were talking about the symbolic aspect of all of this. And I think for people, it's important to realize that when you were talking about the insignificance of the number 11, you can actually find a photo of a well-known Satanist who was followed by a lot of British power elites and a lot of celebrities to this very day, and that's Aleister Crowley. And you can find him in a photo where he has his arms up like this, and it's symbolizing the number 11. So for people that are just saying, well, Raza does, it's just, he doesn't really know what he's talking about, he knows exactly what he's talking about. And you can find that symbology everywhere. So I wanted to make that point. So before we wrap up, Raza, I want you to get to some more of your background here. And is there anything else that you want to add more that will help put this whole series, the Smoking Gun series, in context?
Okay. I have a lot of people asking me questions in the group about why isn't China blowing the whistle on this moon landings? And as I mentioned, China is receiving technological support from NASA. As most people are aware, China was banned from the ISS. But this was just some members of Congress who wanted China to be banned. And NASA didn't agree with this, but they were forced to follow it. So what they did was they just leaking the technology through the European Space Agency. The Chinese space station is basically just a copy of the ISS. If they wanted to, these two space stations could link up because it's the same technology. Now, the thing is, China has an agreement with NASA. We will wait for you to admit the Apollo missions were a hoax. We're going to wait. You said you'd do it in 2025, 2026, maybe. We're hoping for that deadline for Artemis 3, that it actually works out. They can fulfill their promise and admit the Apollo missions were a hoax. Now, the way China did this agreement, they said, we will not expose the fact it was a hoax, but we are also not going to lie for you. Many other countries have this same agreement with NASA. For example, India. India has this same agreement, but India agreed to lie for them. So what happened was India sent this space probe around the moon, Chandrayaan, which photographed the Apollo landing sites. And then they did a Zoom conference where they released an image of the Apollo 11 landing site, and it showed that it was an unmanned craft. There was no footprints there. And it was a three-legged craft, not a four-legged craft. So they released this photo on a Zoom conference. And this photo shows that the Apollo missions were a hoax. But then what happened was NASA said, wait a minute, you weren't supposed to expose that thing. So India said, sorry. And then they said, how can we make it up to you? And then NASA gave them an LRO image of the Apollo 12 landing site. And they said, just release this one, because this one has the footprints around the ship. So India said, okay. So India released this Apollo 12 landing site image, which they didn't even take themselves. It's just a photoshopped garbage. I'm 100% sure that Elon Musk agreed to lie for NASA. You don't win a NASA contract without agreeing to lie for them. It's like there was one interview where Musk, and they were asking him, Musk, what do you think about the problems of space radiation? And Musk was, it's not such a big problem. Because he agreed to lie for them. Of course, it's the number one problem. He knows all about it, but he can't say that. But China doesn't have that. China is like, we are not going to lie for you. So the reason why this is important is because if you go to the Wikipedia webpage called Third-Party Evidence for the Apollo Moon Landings, and you look up China, it says China found evidence that the Apollo missions were real. This is totally false, okay? You go to the Wikipedia and you look for the reference, okay? Where is your reference? Where do you say that? And down at the bottom of the page, you can click on the left reference. It's a dead link. There's no reference. They're just making a false statement. On Internet Archives, you can find what China said. What was the official statement China said? You can find it on Internet Archives. China said, "We have found evidence of the Apollo missions," which means something landed there. China's tactics are don't make enemies with these people. So we're not going to publicly say that it was a hoax, and we're not going to publicly say it was real either. We just said we found evidence. That's the official Chinese government's statement. Now, in 2016, I was offered a job with the Chinese Space Agency, and I said, "You have photographs of the Apollo landing sites, right?"
Yeah.
And of course they did, because that was in 2012. The Chang'e 2 made the first ever complete lunar map, was completed in 2012. And that was a low resolution map. So they said, yes, we've seen the Apollo landing sites. We can actually prove that it was a hoax, but we're not releasing those images. And since 2012, there's been other Chang'e missions which have much higher resolution cameras. I had seen the Chinese images in 2016, but you couldn't really make out what was there at the Apollo landing sites because it wasn't so high res. But since then, we have some higher res images of the Apollo landing sites, which show beyond a shadow of a doubt that these were just simply unmanned crafts.
No, it's interesting you say that, because I don't have a lot of expertise when it comes to analyzing the photographic records, so that's why I go into other areas. But even I noticed that there are some photos of the lunar surface going back from the 1960s that have far better resolution and clarity than the photos you see that were released in 2009 from the LRO of the supposed landing sites, of the Apollo landing sites. And I mean, you don't have to be a trained expert to see that there's a problem there. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, they were offering far more clarity with the limited technology they had from their unmanned space missions to the lunar surface, versus 40, 50 years later, and they released a photo of the Apollo 11 landing site, and it's just a smear, for a layperson's way of putting it. I mean, it's even obvious to the untrained eye is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, these are pretty bad Photoshop jobs. One thing that I did research is on several of the Apollo videos, when the ship is taking off, there's the inside camera looking down. And in some of the liftoff scenes, you can see the ground and where the footprints are. Now, for me, the first thing I did was I was going to check with the Apollo videos. Are the footprints the same from the videos as they are on these LRO images? And they are. They do check out. So this brings up the question, my favorite question is, how did they pull this thing off? So the way they pulled it off is they sent unmanned crafts, and those crafts would take photos of the areas of the landing site. And they used that data to create the studio sets. They created all the mountain backdrops. And they had planned out the astronauts are going to walk over here and walk over there, and they're going to leave footprints and rover tracks. That was all scripted out, where they were going to go, where they're going to walk, where they're going to drive. And then when they filmed the liftoff scene, they had all the footprints right. So naturally, when they made the LRO images, then they just used Photoshop to paint the same footprints and rover tracks. But it brings up the question, would those footprints and rover tracks still be visible today? The moon is bombarded with thousands of tons of micrometeorites every year. And not only that, there are winds on the moon. It's an electromagnetic whirlwinds. So what we know about the moon today compared to what they knew back then. So the whole theory that 40 years later they could photograph the footprints, it's kind of a nonsense theory. But most people aren't scientists, so they don't think that way. They see the footprints, oh yes, there's the proof it was real.
Yeah. And that also brings up the issue of the degradation and what the degradation of the equipment itself would be from that constant bombardment from the other elements that you would find in that region of space. So, I mean, there's a lot that a lot of people don't take into consideration. They see the footprints and they say yes. Now, Raza, before we wrap up, I just want to get back to a little bit about your background here. And I just noticed that you're currently writing papers right now for the Chinese Space Agency. Specifically, I'm reading here in terms of radiation in deep space. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that and exactly what you're doing right now? And that gives people a better appreciation of your background and knowledge when it comes to this video series that you and I are doing.
So I was first offered the job to work with the Chinese Space Agency in 2016. But at that time, I turned them down because at that time, I wasn't interested in space, really. I was working in other departments. I was working in the free energy department. But later, I had a change of heart. In 2022, I decided to take them up on the offer. And I said, okay, I'll work for you. What do you want me to do? And they said, try to find out what NASA is doing to try to protect the astronauts from the radiation of deep space. And so that's my job. I basically just studying the materials that the ships are made out of, was the boron nitride nanotubes. This is the shielding which the Artemis ship is made out of it, and the Artemis suits are made out of boron nitride nanotubes, because that is the best material human beings have come up with for blocking out radiation. Plus also they're going to put bags of water on the inside walls of the ship. So the water and the boron nitride nanotubes, these are the primary means which Artemis is using now to protect the astronauts. That's my job. I'm just writing articles. I'm trying to find out, because that technology has not been released to China yet, how to manufacture boron nitride nanotubes. But as I mentioned, China has an agreement with NASA. If China doesn't blow the whistle, then NASA will share that technology with us. It's just a part-time job. You know, I have 3 jobs. One, I'm writing papers on quantum energy. And the second part-time job, I'm writing papers on radiation shielding. But my full-time job, I'm just an English teacher. I teach English at the university near the launch pad.
Well, I wouldn't say just. That's pretty impressive, teaching English so to people who as a second language. So that's quite a task. There is something, I haven't got time to get into it now, but you've really got my interest here when you mentioned the technology involved here. And in terms of carrying water, that gets into a whole other area of thrust per weight. So, you know, to get that kind of weight up off the launch pad. So that's another area we can definitely focus on in our next subsequent videos. But Raza, is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up?
There's one song I just posted on my channel. Okay, it says, if the people lead, the leaders will have to follow. People, take the lead, you know. And then the song also says, as long as someone else controls your history, the truth to you will remain a mystery. This is my main thing, is I hope more people will start studying history. You know, I just told you about the history of the bankers and the history of China, history of Israel, the Israel-Chinese relationships, Chinese-Palestine relationships. Just study history. And this is what they don't want you to know. I just mentioned a few other important things. China joined the World Trade Organization 6 days after 9/11. Look it up. I'm not just making these things up. That's the reason why 9/11 happened, is because China kicked out their private central bank in 1949. And ever since the World Trade Organization was formed, China's like, no, we don't want to be part of that. We're going to get our own oil. So they were trying to build an oil pipeline through Afghanistan. And as soon as the US troops came and cut it off, China was forced to join the World Trade Organization. They still don't have a private central bank. And that's the goal of these bankers now. Their goal is to bring private central banking back to China. And this is what the whole World War III is about. They're trying to get China in bed with Russia and Iran because those two are already puppets. But China's not a puppet. So the real agenda is to get the private central bank back into China. It's not going to be easy. But China is an inferior military. If the bankers go ahead with their World War III, there's not much China's going to be able to do about that. Study your history. Okay. Study your history. The Rothschilds created the private central bank. They killed the Kennedy. They did 9/11. It's all here in this book. More people need to learn these things because the more we can help people become educated about these subjects, then the less people will participate in all these banker wars. That's what I'm trying to do here. Just help people to wake up and realize that we shouldn't just believe the media. And also the alternative media is full of disinformation. You wanted me to talk about the last 3 years. I assume you're talking about the COVID thing. And if you don't mind, I just want to mention the last thing here. Because I was actually in Wuhan when the COVID broke out. And I am a medical doctor. I studied virology and immunology in medical school in America. And the thing was, just before the virus broke out, there was something called the Wuhan Military Games. China had invited all the militaries of the whole world into an Olympic Games. And that was being held in Wuhan just before the virus broke out. Now, what happened was China, as I mentioned, invited every country of the world, and that means China also invited Palestine. Now, Israel does not recognize the existence of Palestine. Okay, Palestine's not a country. So Israel got extremely mad that China invited Palestine to the Wuhan Military Games. So Israel boycotted the Wuhan Military Games. Israel and 5 other countries, which they control, also boycotted the Wuhan Military Games. And just after the games, just a short time thereafter, I was actually in Wuhan for the games because I'm like, wow, here's the Palestine participating in these military Olympic Games, and I was actually supporting Palestine. So yeah, good way to go, guys. And then just a short time after that, the virus broke out. And I don't want to listen to people saying it was a hoax. You know, I saw thousands of people dying with my own eyes. It's not a fake virus, and it was certainly not created by the Chinese government. This is just nonsense theories. Like I'm saying, this is the kind of information that more people need to learn because we're being divided and conquered here. Fox News said it was created in the Wuhan lab. This is just total nonsense. I even know the people in the Wuhan lab. Also, people need to learn, it's not the first one. There was the SARS in 2003, was the SARS breakout. Right. And then later was the MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. That was also, what is a coronavirus? Coronavirus is an animal disease. Okay, it only circulates among animals. And human beings have been living aside animals for 10,000 years. And so that coronavirus doesn't cross the line into humans. It has to be genetically RNA modified in some way to cross that barrier. And so it's, like I said, but it's not the first time. There was the SARS breakout, the MERS breakout, and then the COVID-19 breakout. I just hope that more people would study their history, try to research some of the things I'm saying here. And if you have disagreements with me, please tell me about them.
I would also like to add, Dan, it's a very good point you raised, Raza, and I'd also like to add to all the people out there, be very careful. I think your message is very, very clear. And I'm going to end on this message because it's such a positive note. For all the people listening right now, take the lead. Take the lead. Do your own research. Do your own thinking. You don't have to have a discipline in a certain academic area to have an opinion. You have intelligence. Use it. And the last 3 years has been an eye-opening experience for a lot of people because of what, Raza, you've been talking about in terms of the virus that came out. A lot of people were led into making very disastrous decisions. And it is because they have not taken the lead, and people need to take the lead for themselves. And as a result of all of this, We've had, I think, the largest ever distrust in science as a result of what has happened in the last few years. So I say to people, Raz, I love that message, and we're going to end on this one. Take the lead.
Like a wrecking ball going back and forth in a line